Marcus Williams sat in the back corner of Jefferson Elementary's music room, trying to make himself invisible. At 12 years old, he had already learned that being the only black student in most of his classes meant drawing attention he didn't want. The worn wooden chair creaked under him as he shifted, watching his classmates file in for their weekly music lesson. Mrs. Henderson, the music teacher, stood at the front of the room with her usual stern expression. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her glasses perched on the end of her nose as she surveyed the class. Marcus had noticed how her eyes always seemed to skip over him, like he wasn't really there. "Today, we're going to learn about classical music," Mrs. Henderson announced, her voice echoing in the small room filled with various instruments. Classical music represents the highest form of musical achievement. It requires proper training, discipline, and refinement. Marcus noticed how she paused on that last word, her gaze briefly landing on him before moving away. He had heard that tone before from other teachers, that subtle way of suggesting he didn't belong. The lesson continued with Mrs. Henderson playing recordings of famous composers. She talked about Mozart, Beethoven, and Chopin with reverence, as if they were gods rather than people. Marcus found himself genuinely interested despite her dismissive attitude. The melodies spoke to something deep inside him, something he couldn't quite name. "The piano," Mrs. Henderson said, walking over to the old upright piano that dominated one corner of the room, "is the king of instruments. It takes years of proper instruction to master even the simplest pieces." She played a simple melody, her fingers moving across the keys with practiced ease. Marcus watched intently, his mind somehow processing the connection between her finger movements and the sounds that emerged. It looked almost like a conversation, the piano responding to her touch. "Now, who would like to try?" Mrs. Henderson asked, though her tone suggested she already knew who she would choose. Several hands shot up eagerly. Sarah Mitchell, the mayor's daughter, waved her hand enthusiastically. Tommy Rodriguez, whose parents owned the local music store, practically bounced in his seat. These were the students Mrs. Henderson usually called on, the ones from families who could afford private lessons. But today was different. Today, Mrs. Henderson's eyes landed on Marcus with a cold smile that made his stomach drop. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying an odd sweetness that didn't reach her eyes, "why don't you come up and show us what you can do?" The classroom fell silent. Marcus felt every pair of eyes turned toward him. His classmates' expressions ranged from curiosity to barely concealed amusement. Some of them were already whispering to each other, anticipating what they clearly expected to be his humiliation. I don't know how to play," Marcus said quietly, hoping she would choose someone else. "Oh, come now," Mrs. Henderson said, her fake smile growing wider. "Surely you can manage something. Music is supposed to be natural for your people, isn't it? All that rhythm and soul we hear so much about." The words hit Marcus like a slap. He felt his face grow hot with embarrassment and anger. He wanted to refuse, to walk out of the room, but he knew that would only make things worse. His mother had taught him to be respectful, even when others weren't respectful to him. Slowly, Marcus stood up and walked to the front of the room. Each step felt like walking through mud. The piano bench seemed miles away, and when he finally reached it, his legs felt weak as he sat down. Mrs. Henderson stood beside him, her arms crossed. "Go ahead," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Show us what natural musical ability looks like." Marcus stared at the keys. They were yellowed with age, some slightly chipped at the edges. 88 black and white rectangles that might as well have been a foreign language. Behind him, he could hear his classmates shifting in their seats, waiting for the show to begin. He pressed the key tentatively. The note rang out clear and pure in the quiet room. Then another, and another. Something strange happened as his fingers touched the keys. The melody Mrs. Henderson had played earlier began to emerge, note by note, as if his hands remembered what his mind hadn't consciously learned. The whispering behind him stopped. Marcus found himself pressing keys with growing confidence, his right hand picking out the simple melody while his left hand somehow found notes that supported it. He didn't understand how he knew which keys to press, but something inside him seemed to guide his fingers. Mrs. Henderson's confident smile began to falter. What was supposed to be a moment of humiliation was becoming something else entirely. Marcus was actually playing the melody correctly, and, more than that, he was adding small embellishments that made it his own. But, just as Marcus was beginning to feel a spark of joy from the music, Mrs. Henderson's hand came down hard on the keys, creating a jarring crash that stopped him mid-phrase. "That's enough," she said sharply, her face flushed with something between anger and embarrassment. "You clearly have some instinct for this. But real piano playing requires proper instruction, not just random noise-making." Marcus's hands froze above the keys. The magic of the moment was broken, replaced by the familiar sting of dismissal. But something had changed inside him. For those few minutes, the piano had felt like home. "You see, class," Mrs. Henderson continued, addressing the room while Marcus remained at the bench. "This is why we need formal training. Without proper instruction, music becomes nothing more than—" She paused, searching for the right word— jungle noise. The racist implication hung in the air like smoke. Marcus felt his cheeks burn with humiliation, but underneath the shame, something else was growing. A determination he hadn't felt before. As he walked back to his seat, avoiding the stares of his classmates, Marcus made a silent promise to himself. He would learn to play that piano properly, not to prove anything to Mrs. Henderson or his classmates, but because the music had awakened something in him that he couldn't ignore. The rest of the class passed in a blur. Mrs. Henderson returned to her lecture about proper musical education, occasionally glancing at Marcus as if expecting him to cause more trouble. But Marcus wasn't listening anymore. In his mind, he was still at the piano, feeling the keys respond to his touch, hearing the melody flow from somewhere deep inside him. When the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Marcus was the first one out the door. He needed to get away from Mrs. Henderson's disapproving glare and his classmates' curious stares. But as he walked down the hallway toward his next class, he couldn't shake the memory of those few magical moments at the piano. That evening, Marcus sat at the dinner table with his mother, Angela, picking at his meatloaf without much appetite. Angela worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat since his father had died 3 years earlier. But she always made sure they had dinner together when she wasn't working her evening shift at the hospital. "How was school today, baby?" she asked, her tired eyes still managing to focus completely on him. Marcus hesitated. He didn't want to worry his mother with stories about Mrs. Henderson's racism. Angela had enough to deal with without adding his problems to her plate. But something about the day felt too important to keep to himself. "Mom," he said slowly, "do you think I could learn to play piano?" Angela raised an eyebrow. This wasn't what she had expected him to say. "Piano? Where did that come from?" Marcus told her about the music class, carefully leaving out the worst parts of Mrs. Henderson's behavior. He focused on how the piano had felt under his fingers, how the music had seemed to come from somewhere beyond his conscious knowledge. Angela listened carefully, studying her son's face as he spoke. She could see excitement there, but also something deeper, a hunger she recognized because she had felt it herself once, long ago. "Piano lessons are expensive, Marcus," she said gently, "and we're just barely making ends meet as it is." Marcus nodded, his excitement deflating. He had expected this answer, but hearing it still hurt. But Angela continued, and Marcus looked up hopefully there might be another way. "Your grandmother used to play piano. She taught me a little when I was young. Her old piano is still up in your grandfather's attic." Marcus had never met his grandfather. Angela's father had cut ties with her when she married Marcus's father, disapproving of the interracial relationship. But Marcus knew his grandfather lived alone in a big house across town, and that Angela still worried about the old man despite their estrangement. "Do you think he would let me practice on it?" Marcus asked. Angela was quiet for a long moment, weighing the complications. "I don't know, baby. It's been years since we've spoken. But maybe it's time to try." That night, Marcus lay in bed thinking about the piano keys under his fingers and his grandmother he had never met. Somewhere across town was an instrument that might unlock the musical feelings growing inside him. The question was whether his grandfather would give him the chance to try. Outside his window, the city hummed with its usual nighttime sounds, but Marcus was hearing something else entirely. In his mind, melodies were forming, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be played. Mrs. Henderson had intended to humiliate him, but instead, she had introduced him to something that felt like destiny. The next morning would bring new challenges, but Marcus fell asleep with music in his head and determination in his heart. He didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. The old Victorian house stood at the end of Maple Street like a forgotten monument to better days. Its paint was peeling, and the garden was overgrown, but it still held traces of former grandeur. Marcus stood on the sidewalk, his mother's hand warm on his shoulder, both of them staring at the house where Angela had grown up. "I haven't been here in 8 years," Angela whispered, more to herself than to Marcus. "Not since your father's funeral." Marcus squeezed his mother's hand. He knew this was hard for her, but his need to touch those piano keys again was stronger than his fear. 3 days had passed since the incident in music class, and he hadn't been able to stop thinking about the moment when a melody had flowed through his fingers like it belonged there. They walked up the cracked concrete path to the front door. Angela hesitated before knocking, her hand trembling slightly. When the door opened, Marcus found himself face to face with a tall, thin man with silver hair and deep lines around his eyes. Those eyes were the same warm brown as his mother's. "Angela." The old man's voice cracked with surprise. "Hello, Dad," Angela said softly. For a moment, neither of them moved. Marcus could feel the weight of years of hurt and misunderstanding hanging between them. Then his grandfather's gaze shifted to him, taking in every detail of his face. "This is Marcus," Angela said. "Your grandson." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Marcus had been prepared for rejection, but what he saw in his grandfather's eyes wasn't anger. It was something more complicated, something that looked almost like regret. "He looks like David," his grandfather said finally, referring to Marcus's father. Angela nodded. "He has his father's eyes." Another long pause. Then, unexpectedly, Marcus's grandfather stepped aside. "Come in," he said quietly. The inside of the house was like stepping back in time. Heavy furniture filled rooms with high ceilings, and dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through tall windows. Family photos lined the mantelpiece, including several of Angela as a young girl. Marcus noticed that the photos stopped abruptly around the time his parents would have gotten married. "What brings you here, Angela?" his grandfather asked, settling into a worn leather armchair. After all this time, Angela explained about Marcus's experience in music class, carefully describing his apparent natural ability without going into detail about Mrs. Henderson's cruelty. As she spoke, Marcus watched his grandfather's face for any sign of what he was thinking. "So you want to use your grandmother's piano?" his grandfather said when Angela finished. "If it's not too much trouble," Marcus said, speaking for the first time since they'd arrived. "I know we haven't. I know you don't really know me, but music is really important to me now." His grandfather studied him for a long moment. "Your grandmother Rose would have liked you," he said finally. "She always said music could bridge any gap, heal any hurt." He paused, looking out the window. Maybe she was right. He led them through the house to a room Marcus hadn't noticed before. When his grandfather opened the door, Marcus's breath caught in his throat. There, in the center of the room, sat the most beautiful piano he had ever seen. It was a baby grand, its black surface gleaming despite a thin layer of dust. The bench was positioned exactly right, waiting for someone to sit down and bring the instrument to life. "She hasn't been played in 5 years," his grandfather said sadly. "Not since Rose passed away. I always meant to have her tuned, but..." Marcus approached the piano like it was something sacred. His fingers hovered over the keys, afraid to touch them without permission. "Go ahead," his grandfather said softly. Marcus pressed middle C, and the note rang out clear and true. Even untuned, The piano had a warmth and richness that the old upright at school couldn't match. His fingers found the melody from music class, but this time he wasn't nervous or embarrassed. This time, the music felt like coming home. As Marcus played, he became aware that his grandfather was moving around the room, opening windows to let in fresh air and pulling sheets off furniture he hadn't noticed before. The room was coming alive around him, awakening from years of silence. When Marcus finished the simple melody, he turned to find both his mother and grandfather watching him with tears in their eyes. "That was Rose's favorite piece," his grandfather said, his voice thick with emotion. "She used to play it every morning while she made coffee." "I didn't know," Marcus said quickly. "I'm sorry if I don't apologize," his grandfather interrupted. "It's the most beautiful thing I've heard in this house since she died." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Your grandmother always said music had a way of finding the right people." From that day forward, Marcus's life took on a new rhythm. Every day after school, he would walk the 6 blocks to his grandfather's house, let himself in with the key he'd been given, and spend hours at Rose's piano. His grandfather, whose name was Frank, would often sit in the room with him, sometimes sharing stories about Rose and her love of music. Marcus learned that his grandmother had been a music teacher before she married Frank. She had taught piano to children in the neighborhood, always believing that music could transform lives. Frank pulled out boxes of her old sheet music, method books, and recordings, creating a treasure trove of musical education that Marcus devoured hungrily. Without formal lessons, Marcus taught himself to read music by matching the notes on the page to the keys under his fingers. Frank helped when he could, remembering fragments of what Rose had taught him over their 40 years of marriage. It wasn't traditional instruction, but it was filled with love and patience that no formal teacher could have provided. Progress came quickly. Marcus had what musicians call a good ear. He could hear when notes were wrong and instinctively knew how to fix them. Within weeks, he was playing simple pieces from Rose's beginner books. Within months, he was tackling more complex compositions that challenged both his technical skills and his musical understanding. But not everything was easy. At school, Mrs. Henderson continued to make Marcus's life difficult. She seemed personally offended by his growing musical ability, as if his success somehow diminished her authority. She found ways to exclude him from musical activities, claiming he wasn't ready or needed more basic training that she wasn't willing to provide. His classmates' reactions were mixed. Some were genuinely impressed when they heard rumors about his piano playing, but others seemed to resent his ability. Sarah Mitchell, the mayor's daughter who had always been Mrs. Henderson's favorite, was particularly hostile. "I've been taking lessons since I was 4, she told a group of students within Marcus's hearing. Real lessons with a certified instructor, not just fooling around on some old piano. Marcus tried to ignore comments like these, but they stung. He began to doubt himself, wondering if what he was learning was somehow inferior because it didn't come from a formal teacher with credentials. These doubts grew stronger when Mrs. Henderson announced that the school would be holding its annual spring recital. Students who wanted to participate could audition to perform a piece of their choosing. Marcus's heart leaped at the possibility, but Mrs. Henderson quickly dashed his hopes. Of course, participation is limited to students who have been receiving proper instruction, she announced, her eyes briefly meeting Marcus's before looking away. We maintain certain standards for our school performances. That afternoon, Marcus sat at Rose's piano feeling more discouraged than he had in weeks. His fingers moved automatically through a piece he'd been working on, but his heart wasn't in it. Frank noticed his mood immediately. "What's troubling you, son?" Frank asked, settling into the chair he'd claimed as his own in the music room. Marcus told him about the recital and Mrs. Henderson's requirements. As he spoke, he could see anger building in his grandfather's eyes. "That woman has no right to judge your musical education," Frank said firmly. "Rose taught dozens of children who went on to successful musical careers, and she never had a fancy degree or certification." "But maybe Mrs. Henderson is right," Marcus said quietly. "Maybe what I'm learning here isn't real musical education." Frank stood up, and walked to a cabinet Marcus had never seen him open before. He pulled out a thick folder and brought it back to Marcus. "These are letters," Frank said, opening the folder. Letters from Rose's former students. They wrote to thank her for changing their lives through music. Marcus read letter after letter from people who credited Rose with giving them not just musical skills, but confidence, joy, and a lifelong love of music. Many had gone on to become professional musicians, music teachers, and composers. "Your grandmother taught from the heart," Frank said. She believed that music education wasn't about following rigid rules or impressing people with technical perfection. It was about connecting with something beautiful and eternal. That evening, as Marcus walked home, he thought about Frank's words. Maybe Mrs. Henderson's approval wasn't as important as he had thought. Maybe what mattered was the music itself and how it made him feel when he played. But he still wanted to prove himself. Not to gain Mrs. Henderson's acceptance, but to honor Rose's memory and Frank's faith in him. He wanted to show that love and dedication could triumph over prejudice and narrow-mindedness. The idea came to him gradually over the following days. If he couldn't participate in the official school recital, maybe he could create his own opportunity to perform. Maybe it was time to step out of the shadows and let his music speak for itself. Marcus began practicing with renewed intensity, working on a piece that would showcase everything he had learned. He chose one of the more challenging pieces from Rose's collection, a beautiful nocturne that required both technical skill and emotional depth. As he practiced, Frank would sometimes share stories about Rose performing the same piece years earlier. These stories helped Marcus understand not just how to play the notes correctly, but how to interpret the music with feeling and expression. The spring recital was still weeks away, but Marcus was already forming a plan. He didn't know exactly how he would execute it, but he was determined to find a way to share his music with the world. Mrs. Henderson had tried to silence him, but she had unknowingly set in motion events that would prove music's power to overcome hatred and ignorance. In the quiet of his grandfather's house, with Rose's piano responding to his touch and Frank's encouraging presence nearby, Marcus prepared for what would become the most important performance of his young life. The Jefferson Elementary gymnasium buzzed with excitement on the evening of the spring recital. Parents filled the folding chairs, cameras ready to capture their children's performances. A small stage had been set up at one end of the gym, with the school's old upright piano positioned prominently in the center. Marcus sat in the back of the auditorium with his mother and Frank, watching as Mrs. Henderson fussed over last-minute arrangements. She wore her best dress for the occasion and moved with the self-importance of someone orchestrating a major cultural event. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Henderson announced into the microphone, "welcome to Jefferson Elementary's annual spring music recital. Tonight, you'll hear from our most talented students, all of whom have received proper musical instruction." Marcus felt his grandfather tense beside him at the word proper. Over the past few months, Frank had become increasingly protective of Marcus's musical journey, often muttering about narrow-minded teachers who didn't understand what real musical education looked like. The performances began with Sarah Mitchell playing a simple Mozart minuet. She played competently, hitting all the right notes with mechanical precision, but Marcus could hear the difference between her playing and his own. Her music was technically correct, but emotionally empty, like reading words without understanding their meaning. One by one, students took the stage. Some played piano, others violin or flute. All had clearly been drilled extensively on their pieces, and all performed with the same careful, soulless accuracy that Marcus was beginning to recognize as Mrs. Henderson's signature style. "She's trained them like robots," Frank whispered to Angela. "Where's the joy? Where's the life in the music?" As the recital progressed, Marcus felt his resolve strengthening. He had spent weeks perfecting his plan, and tonight was the night he would put it into action. During the intermission, while parents mingled and children changed into their second-half costumes, Marcus slipped away from his family. He had studied the layout of the school carefully. He knew that Mrs. Henderson's music room was directly above the gymnasium, and he knew that the old building's ventilation system carried sound remarkably well between floors. He also knew that Mrs. Henderson would be too busy managing the recital to notice one missing audience member. Marcus made his way through the familiar hallways to the music room. The door was unlocked, as he had hoped it would be. Inside, the old upright piano sat silent in the darkness. It wasn't the beautiful instrument he had grown accustomed to at Frank's house, but it would serve his purpose. He sat at the bench and placed his hands on the keys, feeling their familiar resistance under his fingers. For a moment, doubt crept in. What if his plan failed? What if no one could hear him? What if Mrs. Henderson found him and threw him out? Then he thought about Rose, the grandmother he had never met, but who had become so real to him through her music and Frank's stories. He thought about all the students she had taught, all the lives she had touched through her belief that music belonged to everyone, regardless of their background or formal training. Marcus began to play. He had chosen Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, one of the most beautiful and technically demanding pieces in Rose's collection. It was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious for someone with his limited formal training, but Marcus had poured his heart into learning every note, every phrase, every subtle expression marking. The music flowed from his fingers like water, each note perfectly placed and emotionally charged. This wasn't the mechanical playing he had heard downstairs. This was music that told a story, that painted pictures in the air, that spoke directly to the human soul. Downstairs in the gymnasium, the second half of the recital was just beginning when people started to notice something strange. A beautiful melody was drifting down from somewhere above them, weaving itself around the official performance on stage. At first, people thought it might be a recording, but the sound was too pure, too immediate, too alive. Mrs. Henderson was introducing the next performer when she became aware of the distraction. Parents were looking up at the ceiling, straining to identify the source of the mysterious music. Some were pulling out their phones, trying to record what they were hearing. As I was saying, Mrs. Henderson said loudly, trying to regain control of her audience, "Tommy Rodriguez will now perform." But her words were lost as Marcus's playing reached the first dramatic climax of the nocturne. The melody soared through the building with such beauty and passion that conversation in the gymnasium gradually died away. Even the scheduled performer on stage stopped what he was doing and listened transfixed. Mrs. Henderson's face turned red with anger and embarrassment. She knew immediately who must be responsible for this disruption. That boy, that troublemaker who had somehow learned to play despite her best efforts to discourage him, was stealing the spotlight from her carefully orchestrated event. "Excuse me for just a moment," she announced tersely, then marched out of the gymnasium with determined steps. Upstairs, Marcus was lost in the music. The cramped classroom had fallen away, and he was alone with Chopin's genius, channeling the composer's romantic yearning through his own young hands. He had never played with such freedom and expression before. Every technique he had learned, every emotion he had discovered through music poured out of him in a torrent of sound. He was approaching the piece's tender, introspective middle section when he heard footsteps in the hallway. Mrs. Henderson's voice echoed angrily as she called for the janitor to unlock doors and find the source of the unauthorized performance. Marcus could have stopped playing. He could have slipped out a back exit and avoided confrontation. But something inside him refused to be silenced again. This was his moment, his chance to show the world what music could be when it came from the heart instead of from rigid rules and prejudiced assumptions. He kept playing, pouring even more emotion into the music as Mrs. Henderson's footsteps grew closer. The nocturne's beautiful melody seemed to gain power from his defiance, becoming more expressive and moving with each passing phrase. The door burst open just as Marcus reached the piece's triumphant return to the opening theme. Mrs. Henderson stood in the doorway, her face twisted with rage, but for a moment she seemed frozen by the beauty of what she was hearing. "Stop this immediately," she finally shouted, striding toward the piano. But Marcus didn't stop. He was in the final stretch of the piece now, approaching the delicate, fading conclusion that required the most subtle touch and musicality. Mrs. Henderson could shout all she wanted, but he was going to finish what he had started. Downstairs, the gymnasium had fallen into complete silence. Parents and children sat mesmerized by the music floating down from above. Many were in tears, moved by the raw emotion and technical brilliance they were witnessing. This wasn't a child playing piano. This was an artist communicating something profound and universal. Frank sat with tears streaming down his face, his hand clasped tightly in Angela's. "That's Rose's teaching," he whispered. "That's what she always tried to show her students. Music isn't about following rules. It's about expressing your soul." As Marcus played the final, whispered notes of the nocturne, a hush fell over the entire building. The last note faded into silence, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. Then, from downstairs came the sound of applause. It started slowly, with just a few people clapping, but quickly built into thunderous appreciation. Parents were on their feet, cheering for a performance they couldn't even see, but which had moved them more deeply than anything else they had heard that evening. Mrs. Henderson stood beside the piano, her authority completely undermined by what had just happened. She had intended the spring recital to showcase her teaching methods and maintain her position as the school's musical gatekeeper. Instead, a 12-year-old boy with no formal training had just demonstrated what real musical education could accomplish. "How did you learn to play like that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus looked at her steadily, no longer intimidated by her disapproval. "I learned from my grandmother," he said simply. "She taught me that music belongs to everyone, not just people who can afford fancy lessons." At that moment, Frank appeared in the doorway, followed by Angela and several parents who had come looking for the mysterious pianist. When they saw Marcus at the piano, understanding dawned on their faces. "This is my grandson," Frank announced proudly, "and he's been taught by the best music teacher this town ever had, even though she's been gone for 5 years. Mrs. Henderson looked around at the crowd of parents gathering in her classroom, all of them looking at Marcus with admiration and respect. Her carefully constructed world of musical hierarchy and proper credentials was crumbling around her. "But he hasn't had any real training," she protested weakly. "What we just heard was more real than anything you've taught in 30 years, said Mr. Rodriguez, Tommy's father and owner of the local music store. "That boy has a gift, and whoever taught him knew how to nurture it properly." Word of Marcus's performance spread quickly through Jefferson Elementary and beyond. Videos recorded on parents' phones went viral on social media, with classical music lovers around the world marveling at the young pianist's extraordinary talent and emotional maturity. Within a week, Marcus received invitations to perform at several local venues. A prestigious music school in the city offered him a full scholarship, recognizing that his unconventional education had produced something far more valuable than technical proficiency alone. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from Mrs. Henderson herself. 3 days after the recital, she appeared at Frank's front door, looking humble and uncertain in a way Marcus had never seen before. "I came to apologize," she said simply. "I was wrong about you, about your music, about what Real teaching means." She explained that the recital had been a wake-up call for her. Hearing Marcus play had reminded her why she had become a music teacher in the first place. Not to enforce rules and maintain social hierarchies, but to help children discover the joy and beauty of music. "I would like to offer you formal lessons," she said to Marcus. "But I understand if you prefer to continue learning the way you have been." Marcus looked at his mother and grandfather, then back at Mrs. Henderson. "I think I'd like to keep learning from both of you," he said thoughtfully. "Grandma Rose always said music was big enough for everyone." Mrs. Henderson smiled, a real smile this time, free from condescension or hidden agendas. "Your grandmother sounds like she was a very wise woman." As the months passed, Marcus continued to develop his extraordinary musical gifts. He performed regularly, studied with visiting master teachers, and eventually earned a place at one of the country's top music conservatories. But he never forgot the lessons he learned in his grandfather's living room, sitting at Rose's piano and discovering that music's greatest power lay not in technical perfection, but in its ability to speak truth and beauty in a world that too often valued neither. Mrs. Henderson, transformed by her encounter with genuine musical passion, became one of Marcus's strongest supporters. She revolutionized her teaching methods, focusing less on rigid technique and more on helping her students find their own musical voices. Years later, she would say that Marcus had taught her more about music in one evening than she had learned in decades of formal education. And in Frank's house, Rose's piano continued to sing under Marcus's fingers, carrying forward the legacy of a woman who had believed that music could heal any hurt and bridge any gap. She had been right all along. Music didn't care about skin color or social status or formal credentials. It only cared about the human heart and the willingness to let that heart sing.